Well, I'm really happy to be here, and I also want to thank Camilla for all of your organizational prowess. My goodness, you've been so organized and keeping everyone on track, and I felt like I had a GPS on me so that I could tell you where I was, so thank you very much. So I like to start out talking about how I got involved studying menstrual hygiene, and it's kind of not necessarily typical. This is Ulysses S. Grant and his wife Julia. He was the President of the United States, and I was a park ranger for the National Park Service in the United States. And I was always interested in everyday life and what people cooked, what the pets were, what they did just on a daily practical basis. And so that was really what got me thinking about, well, how did women handle their periods? And that wasn't really so difficult to figure out, but it got me on the path to thinking about menstrual hygiene. And that led to my dissertation and my first book, Under Wraps, which really, as Camilla mentioned, provides an overview of how menstrual hygiene technologies became produced and accepted, especially in the United States. And with that book, I developed the idea of technologies of passing. And this is the idea that the menstrual hygiene products themselves allow women to pass as if they're not having a period. They can pass as if they're not bleeding, and they can avoid some of the indisposition of having a period, whether that's not being able to go to parties, not being able to go to work, and really just acting as if you're not having a period. And so when I was writing that, there's an image I wasn't able to include, and this is an ad for Rely tampons, and it really reveals the pass in action, which we all are familiar with the white clothes, and you can tell that her menstrual technology is working because there's no stain. And we also know it's working because the dupe is the paramour behind her, who is in, he doesn't know that she has a period, but we do, because her gaze is directed ahead at us. And so the triangular relationship is there with the pass. And this this ad also gestures to the next work that I wanted to research, and that was about toxic shock related to Rely tampons. And that led to my second book, which came out in November, about the history and the relationship of menstrual technologies to women's bodies and their periods. And the truth be told, my interest in this book is from me in middle school when I was about 12 and 13 years old. This is me playing basketball. And I was about to have my period, and there was all sorts of news about this really scary disease that might kill me. And I didn't understand what it was. And I became more afraid because of the labels on the packages. This is federal code from the United States. It says, attention, tampons are associated with toxic shock syndrome. TSS is a rare but serious disease that may cause death. Read and save the enclosed information. This is not helpful. This is really scary because there's no action item for you except to save the enclosed information. And that really does not do the trick. And the more I looked at this, the more I just thought, what is the history of this labeling that it is so askew and not really helping to help women make decisions about menstrual products? And so, as I started researching, I really wanted to put toxic shock in the center of the research, but obviously it's much broader because it overlaps with women and women's bodies, menstruators, as a lot of folks are starting to call them, to include trans folks as well. And not all women menstruate. There's obviously various life cycles, as all of you have been talking about. Thinking about bacterium as agents that have influence and their own sort of agency as well. The tampons and the technology of the tampons, as well as institutions, and how all of that comes together to really inform the way TSS emerges as an illness. So the book really is premised upon this, an idea that I developed as well, of thinking about tampons as biocatalytic technology. And what I mean by this is that the tampon in and of itself is not necessarily dangerous in this regard. It's not causing cancer. It causes, some people have allergic reactions to them. There's other injuries that can happen. But the technology of the tampon catalyzes bacterium that are in the vaginal microflora to actually grow and be very happy and content, but it causes harm then to some women's bodies. And this is a real paradigm shift in thinking about illness. It's not like an injury from those horrible lawn darts, where it's like a direct injury to children or whomever, but it's related to this technological change that is causing shifts within the vaginal microflora. So just to sort of clarify, the bacterium that is responsible for TSS is Staphylococcus aureus. We've known about staph for a very long time, and it's identified by this bright yellow hue of the spheres. It really causes a lot of misery for humans, from food poisoning to rashes. I think of all the boils in 19th century literature that people had. That's all Staphylococcus aureus. Methicillin resistant Staphylococcus aureus is also the real concern right now in hospitals and large institutions, and also TSS. So there's a lot of different variants, but all of this fall under the umbrella of Staphylococcus aureus. Also, just to clarify as well, the definition for TSS that is agreed upon right now is a high fever, rash and skin eruptions. This is a woman's hand from some of the early cases of TSS. Nausea, vomiting, low blood pressure, and eventually multiple organ failure. So it's a very horrible and grisly condition once it starts rolling. It is treatable with antibiotics in the early stages, but once you head into the organ failure part, it's pretty hard to pull people back from that. And not everyone at the time people didn't really know, but because it seemed like a cold that just went really awry. So this is what we know now. But the other thing that was happening concurrently was the introduction of a new kind of tampon, which was the super absorbent tampon. This was in the 1970s, and the 1960s, there were a lot of patents for super absorbents, but they became incorporated into products in the 1970s. This is another ad for Rely tampons, and in this ad, you can see how different the tampon was, because it's shaped like a cup, and so it kind of catches fluid, and it's made out of polyester, sort of like a polyester tea bag on the outside, and then on the inside are more polyester foam cubes, and also a substance called carboxymethylcellulose. And carboxymethylcellulose is a thickening agent. It draws water and liquid to it, so it's hydrophilic. And it's also edible. So it's in food. I'm sure you've eaten it before. It's in like ice creams, pie fillings, things like that. And it's known as grass within the field because it just goes through and you don't digest it and you just excrete it. So as a tampon technology and as an engineer, I could see how it was very exciting to develop these things because they were very different. They did not look like cotton. It was a totally different design, and they worked really well for people who had heavy flow. For women who had less heavy flow, there were incidents of skin actually ripping away with the tampon itself because it just sucked so much fluid into it. So it wasn't for everyone. But the real change, though, was the synthetic components. And why this is important is because now folks understand even better that it's not just the bacterium that is required to trigger toxic shock, but also the changes in the vaginal environment. So when you insert a tampon, it brings oxygen into the usually anaerobic vaginal canal. And that changes the ecosystem for the bacterium, and it changes the types of bacteria that can grow at that moment, as well as the quorum sensing of the bacterium. In addition, the pH is less acidic during menstrual flow, so that changes the environment again for the bacterium. And these two things are really important to make the Staphylococcus bacteria very happy. The other thing that is important is that this might occur in some women, but the women who really suffer are the ones who have not developed the antibody to the toxin, which is called TSST1. Most people, about 80% of us, do have that antibody to the TSST1 toxin, but not everyone does. And some people will never develop it. So if you don't have the toxin, and if you are carrying that bacterium, and about 15 to 20% of people do, it's that Venn diagram of that little narrow section and those are the folks that could be at risk when using a super absorbent tampon. But no one knew this at the time, and it's taken me about 10 years to figure that out as well. So, how do you find an unknown unknown when this is not a usual disease progress? It's not usually how people get ill. There aren't specific cultures or tests for it, and it's related to a technology. And so this is where epidemiology really comes in. And so in the United States, the Centers for Disease Control was really at the center of helping to name the syndrome and working with state departments of epidemiology across the United States. This is a photo of Catherine Shands from People magazine. And this is how public TSS was, that a physician from the CDC would be in People magazine as a public interest story. And in fact, news about TSS was the third most reported upon news story in 1980, behind the presidential election of Reagan and Jimmy Carter, and then related to that was the Iran hostage crisis, and then the next thing was TSS. So it's another watershed moment of women's health being in the news, and I have a whole chapter about how do you communicate about TSS when period, menstruation, tampon really are not meant to be on television airwaves. So Shands was really important in getting the message out. She was the one that took the project on. And in fact, Bruce Dan, who was one of her colleagues, when I interviewed her, she said that he told her, it's such a dead end. You really don't want to do that. And she said, I didn't listen to him, and I did it anyway. So it was really good that she did because she cared. And at this point, people wanted to keep tampons for women. There was a sense that they were part of a toolbox of liberation. And I know there's a broader critique about that now with shame and just reproducing shame. But again, in 1980, the idea was to keep them around for women. So she worked with state epidemiologists. And then over the summer of 1980, there were two different surveys that she conducted with other folks at the CDC. One which finally acknowledged TSS was related to menstruation and tampons, which was a big finding. And then the second one looked at individual tampons to see which tampons were most highly associated with TSS. So by September of 1980, there were 38 deaths of women who had used tampons. By the end of January, there were over 299 cases, and all of the graphs just show how it just keeps going up and up. Almost all of them were in women who were menstruating. There are a few men and boys here and there, but it's predominantly women. And now folks are saying there's between a 1 in 12 chance out of 100,000 to contract TSS. But again, this wasn't known and the data wasn't there at that moment, and so that's what they were collecting and figuring out. So the other 3 folks that were really important at this moment were 3 other women. The photo in color is Nancy Buck, and Nancy Buck was a lawyer, and she was a lawyer for the Food and Drug Administration, and she was the one who really understood consumer product safety, and she also had a new tool at her fingertips called the Medical Device Amendment. And the Medical Device Amendment in the United States was the first set of amendments to regulate hard technologies and medical devices, not pharmaceutical products, but the actual medical device. And since tampons are considered a Category 2 medical device with toothbrushes on one end and pacemakers on the other, tampons fit in the center. And she knew that she could use this to bring a recall against Procter & Gamble because of this connection that the CDC had made between Rely and TSS. So she had that under her belt. The other person who was one of her colleagues and friends was Jonesy Bernstein here on the right. And I've interviewed both of them as well, and Buck always calls her Jonesy, which I kind of like. But so Bernstein was also a lawyer, and she was a lawyer for Health and Human Services. Health and Human Services is a cabinet position to the president. And so the cabinet position was held by Patricia Harris, who was the other person here in the lower corner, and she's passed away now. Patricia Harris, though, she suggested that tampons be banned entirely. That if toxic shock was happening, let's just ban them. And Buck said, no, that's not what we want. And so Buck was really trying to kind of have a more middle ground, but both Joan and Nancy had to do a lot of education to the men around them. And she talked about going to the drugstore and grabbing all kinds of tampon boxes, and they were open them up and hand them around to the men. And she said the men were holding them like hand grenades. They didn't know what to do with them. But the importance of these 3 women is that they were there. They were there and they cared about women's health. They were taking this issue really seriously, and all of them got swept out with the change to President Reagan that was about to happen in the next few months, which happens as it does in the States. And then, of course, Catherine Shands again. So there were feminist-minded women who were very concerned about women's health and had bodily experiences of menstruation. And that's not to say that men can't be sympathetic or can't be allies, but they had, at that moment, it was important that they brought their experiences to the table and their concerns for their daughters and their relatives about tampon safety. So the immediate results were the removal of CMC, which is that carboxymethylcellulose stuff, from diapers as well, because that was looking like it was going to be an issue as well for babies. An advisory about superabsorbent tampons, as well as a very general labeling, which was some of that labeling that I was hearing when I was a kid and really kind of freaked out about. The other thing that Procter & Gamble was required to do was to advertise to not buy its product. It's one of the first times that Procter & Gamble, well, any company, had to have an all-out advertising campaign to not buy the product, to return the product back to stores to get a refund. This was an ad that was in the newspaper, but it was on the radio, it was on television, it was during the soap opera hour of the afternoon, which was considered women's television. So it was, in like the food section of the newspapers. So it was a very kind of sexist and gendered understanding of where women would get that information. But this was part of the consent agreement that Nancy Buck worked out. She said, you know how to advertise. Procter & Gamble is one of the masters of getting, selling products. Use that knowledge to tell women to not use your product now. And so she felt very proud of that. So, great. All these ads are out there, don't use our product, but what do? How should women protect themselves when the superabsorbents are still not labeled? And so women still really could not protect themselves because they had no idea, and there was no way to know what tampon was more absorbent or less absorbent. There was nothing but advertising to sort of describe the content of the tampons. And so the FDA called this task force together, called the Tampon Task Force. And it relied on another organization, which is the American Society for Testing and Materials. And this is getting into the weeds, but the ASTM was established a long time ago, for railroads, because you want railroads to have the same gauge. You want railroads to be able to be, standardized so that different cars can go on the same track. You want screws to have the same threads so that when you buy, a 3-inch screw or whatever, it's going to be the same. And so ASTM is interested in getting things standardized for efficiency. So it's really interesting to me that the ASTM would take on this as a neutral negotiating party to standardize tampons. And the other thing that's important about ASTM was that they brought in consumers, and for the first time, women, which seems a little late by 1980, but there you go. So one of the women they brought in was Esther Rome, and she was a founder of the Boston Women's Health Book Collective and Our Bodies Ourselves. And she was already very interested in women's health, reclaiming the right for women to have information, to not be dictated by male physicians who weren't always it wasn't always in women's best interest. And she was one of the representatives then on this tampon task force. And she really felt that, yes, the standardization needs to happen, but standardization, how do we think about, she didn't even call it a feminist standardization, but this was what she was enacting. What is a feminist practice of standardization? And so at question was the Syngina. And this is the Syngina apparatus for synthetic vagina. You can tell, right? So the synthetic vagina, the Syngina, is a lab apparatus that was devised in the 1950s to test tampon absorbency. And most companies wanted to prove that theirs was the most absorbent. In this case, they need to both standardize a test in order to standardize the absorbencies. So you have to agree upon what is the test that we're going to use in order to do this. And so the Syngina uses blue saline, the blue goo. And so if you think about all those ads with all the little blue drippers that's from the lab. It's not even from the advertisers, which I was really kind of surprised about. But so Rome is saying, okay, is this even legit? Is this really what we want to use? So this is a glass tube here on the outside. On the inside is a condom, and it's chic number 9, which is also obviously very problematic racially. And so the warm water fills up within this tube, and then you put the tampon into the condom, and then the synthetic menstrual fluid comes through the tip, and as it fills up, you watch it fill up until it starts dripping out of the end, and then the test is over, and you measure it before and you measure it after, and you get a gram weight of how much it absorbs. So this Syngina is problematic. And Nancy Ream was a person that Esther Rome reached out to and said, we need some help. We need some feminist-minded scientists to run lab work for us because these corporations have all the labs, they have all the money. We don't have scientists on hand to do this. And so she volunteered. She was a professor at the University of Michigan. And so they sent her the Syngina apparatus. They named theirs Sally. And she ran the same tests that the corporations did, but instead she also used heparinized blood. And heparinized blood is treated with heparin so that it doesn't clot. And that's not exactly menstrual fluid, but it's better than blue saline. And so what she found was that the rankings of the tampons were the same, but the absorbency at the higher levels were not. And so what this meant was that a tampon might absorb more blood than it did saline. But if the standard is based upon saline, it could be mislabeled in that category. So there are some tampons that are categorized at a lower range than what they actually absorb. And this is still built into the tampons that are still on the market today. So this is why the standardization process is so, so important, because once it gets set, it's really hard to change. So this is the absorbency range and the nomenclature that was finally agreed upon. It took over 9 years and several lawsuits and Esther Ream and group to just totally drop out to even get this far. Later writing, Esther Rome and one of her colleagues, Jill Wilhander, said, what we learned is that the materials used in tampons have not been tested adequately. Most have never been studied in the vaginal environment. And they said that the manufacturers have agreed to the Syngina test, but it continues to have the same flaws that Nancy Ream identified. So despite all this, there was the labeling that came into fruition finally by 1989. But the question is it really a warning that they are able to put on or not? So this is back to my tampon box again. And even looking at the different languages, it's sort of interesting that it's not really, is it a warning? Is it an alert? Is it attention? Like, how are we supposed to sort of interpret that? So this is contentious. And there is a linguist named Roger Shuey who was called to testify in a trial, and he takes the language of the tampon box and writes it as if it were a railroad crossing warning. So he said if the tampon box were written, or if a railroad crossing were written like a tampon box, this is how it would sound. Important information about accidents. Read this sign. People can get hit by trains. If you are on the tracks and you see a train coming, drive faster and get away. Or avoid it by stopping first. Danger. Avoid danger by stopping, looking, and listening. If you have been hit by a train, call for medical assistance. Trains are not the only cause of accidents. If you have questions, call Amtrak. So I thought this was a really great analogy to show just how obscure this warning is that are on these boxes, because it does not help us to figure out what to do, how to avoid TSS, or even what to do afterwards. So this is just a very small part of the book, and I wanted to really highlight some of the women's efforts and some of the findings, but the testing and measurement is so important to things that are related to women's bodies, and that they actually represent and have some sort of sense of embodiment, and not just an androcentric sense for men's bodies, or it's not just convenient as a lab apparatus because it can be handled easily. I mean, what does that syngina even test? Is that really an accurate representation of women's variable bodies? I mean, you've seen one vagina, you've seen them all, right? It's like all of it is all the same. And you know, women's bodies are invisibilized, they're instrumentalized, and again, that doesn't help with the variability of women's bodies. The other thing that I think my book points out, and I'm just really fascinated with, is how we engage with the non-human actors of our body in the relationship to the technologies that we're using, especially internally, but even everything from soaps to antibiotics to medical devices. We are in a whole new world of the microbiome that we really do not understand. But I think this is sort of a canary in the coal mine about medical devices and what we might need to think about in terms of bacterium actually interacting with maybe nanotechnologies. I mean, what are they going to do with that? Like, that's just, bacterium are really creative and entrepreneurial. And so we have to think about them with really a lot more respect, I think, than we do. Thinking about illness related to technologies as well. And again, I think menstruation, because it has been so sort of pushed aside as dirty and shameful, it's at our expense because it can reveal a lot about human health and where problems may arise with other technological innovations. And just as you all know already, it's so important to have people of difference involved in decision making because they bring different experiences to the table that are really important to health of us on the whole. So, thank you.
So we have time for some questions, and I believe that the mic is over there.
Hi.
Hi.
That was really fascinating. And I love both your books.
Oh, thank you.
So period products, or like the products that we use for menstruation, would usually, I would say, be considered to be non-standard material culture items because they haven't been used to represent anything about ourselves. People don't performatively use them to represent something about themselves, especially in the remit of passing as non-bleeding and concealment. So what do you think that the performative aspects of environmentally friendly period products, so like menstrual cups and like the things underwear and reusable pads, what do you think that suggests within your kind of paradigm of passing?
Well, they still contribute to passing. So we haven't overcome that need to pass. And part of it is a belief that capitalism will solve our environmental problems, and it won't. I mean, it can contribute to it, but we can't buy our way out of our garbage problems or our plastic problems. Like, we have to make some other social decisions besides just buying more products. So it's not that they're horrible or that, you know, it's great. People are creating them. But it still doesn't kind of change our social lens and our ideas really about menstruation. I mean, it's never, I have a friend who asked me, is there any unearned privilege from having a period? And I thought, I can't think of any. I can't think of like an unearned privilege that you get from leaking or, you know, fluid out of place.
If you don't like sport, you can get out of it at school.
But it depends. It depends on the school. It's not always a rule. And actually, I interviewed a woman who said she would fake her period to study for exams, and then have her period when it was convenient. So, there's using that system that way. So yeah, I think it is interesting to think about it in terms of performativity, but it's not really changing the paradigm.
Hello, I will sneak in with a question.
Yes.
So thank you so much, Sharra. That's a fantastic presentation. So this is a story about rely on the bacteria, absolutely, but it's also a story about Procter & Gamble now.
Yes.
And here in the UK, we've all just had the news that Procter & Gamble will be involved in the Women's Inequalities group on menstrual health or something like that. I'm mismatching alongside Plan UK. So, since Procter & Gamble are now going to have a big impact on the way menstruation policy happens here. Can you tell us anything about corporate history? How do they figure in your story? Anything else?
Well, Procter & Gamble, Procter & Gamble. So the Rely tampon was supposed to usher in Procter & Gamble to the menstrual catamenial industry. And it obviously flopped in a big way. But interestingly, Procter & Gamble turned it to say, oh, we did the right thing. They didn't have to issue a recall because we pulled them back. So it turned into the, what do you do? How do you deal with bad publicity well? So it's like this case study in business for Procter & Gamble. So Procter & Gamble, though, stayed out, and then they bought Tam Brands in, I don't know, the late 90s, I think. But Procter & Gamble, the next piece I'm working on, and I'll be presenting a little bit next week with you, is about Procter & Gamble's search for data. And so Procter & Gamble, with its scientists in 1980, 82, they kept saying, what did we miss? The CDC must be wrong. The CDC has got to be wrong. That's the only thing that can make sense out of all this. And so Procter & Gamble subpoenaed the data from the CDC to get not just the data, but all the women's names. And the CDC said, well, we'll send you 34,000 pages of the data from the epidemiology. And Procter & Gamble said, no, we want the women's names because we need to go through and use our scientists and do the interviews and basically recreate what the CDC did. And so this lawsuit went on for 3 or 4 years. And it's really significant because it appeals, it finally says that there was no right to privacy because they weren't patients. They were part of an epidemiological study. So like Hippocratic Oath, all of that stuff doesn't cover them because they're research subjects. It's not doctor-patient. So the court system said, actually, the CDC needs to have some sense of privacy because why would people tell their sexual histories or some of their intimate details, especially on the cusp of HIV/AIDS? I mean, this is that same moment. So yet another unexpected outcome from tampons and TSS is the right to privacy for some of those scientific studies. So the history of P&G is fraught. So I would go in with open eyes, I guess, with whatever. I don't know. I don't know what the current thinking is, but historically, it's been very much about Procter & Gamble. So.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I work in the humanities, and for us, a really important theoretical trend has been, like you were mentioning, seeing bacteria as agents, seeing tampon as agents, and that's been done theoretically. So Bruno Latour is a big figure who's a sociologist, historian of sciences, but has been really influential in the humanities. Sort of cyborg studies to an extent, so the becoming technologized of human bodies has been a big trend. Feminist work by people like Donna Haraway. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if some of that approach would you see some of this approach as useful in your field to be able to conceptualize the different forces that contribute to toxic shock syndrome? Or do you think that's actually a little bit airy-fairy and we don't need this kind of theorized background?
No, theory is so important, and I just can't do it. I read it, and I always am thinking, okay, what does this mean? Like, what can I ground this in? And so yes, we definitely need theory. We need fantasy. We need philosophies about thinking in different ways. So yes, it's not all like I don't know, stardust or something. It's really important. And that is sort of in the background, I think, as well, about what I'm doing, especially science and technology studies, like you said, feminist theory as well. And just as being trained as a historian, I've just always been really interested in like grounding it in material and facts. But yes, we have to think much more broadly about being non-human centered, and that includes stuff, material culture, as well as all of the life around us and the animacies around us. And I think this is just like a little slice of even where we can go and even think more broadly about that stuff.
Hi, Sharra. Thank
Hi.
you. That was really interesting. It reminded me when you were talking about the syngina. There was a recent study done, and I'm sorry I've forgotten who the authors of it were. I don't know if anyone knows. It was on menstrual cups, and it found that menstrual cups there was a risk of TSS from them, but they only studied in fake, in a what do you call it, a lab situation.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if, so it was difficult to really take it seriously because it was so far detached from, actual women's bodies. And I wondered if anyone has created a way of studying inserted menstrual devices.
It's a good question because you don't want to put women at risk, right? There's certain things, there are good things that come out of lab practice before women become the experimented upon. So, right, you do want some of it, but there's also within science, there's this constraint to get all the variables out that it becomes just, that's as fantastical. Yeah. It doesn't really mean anything then. So I don't know. I haven't followed up on the more recent lab studies. But certainly the Procter & Gamble guys were saying the vaginal, the vaginal environment, it just changes. It just changes no matter what you do. So it was just like, forget it, and that's not acceptable.
Yeah, women as unpredictable and
right.
And I just wanted to mention as well that I did a recent study on menstrual cup use. I wish you'd been here when I was talking about it earlier, but I know that can't have been helped. But,
I would have loved to have been here too.
Yeah, absolutely, outside of anyone's control. But one of the participants in the study got very, very anxious about the hygiene of the cup, largely because her mother was anxious about it. And the comments she made about it was straight out of the Rely controversy. So presumably this is now a second generation issue that her mother would have heard about.
Yeah.
And she passed the same things on because she said she was worried that microbes would grow in her overnight if she left the cup in there, and also that she was worried that in the future they will find out that the cup is really dangerous. So that to me was a direct resonance with the Rely.
Well, and it's not an unreasonable thought,
absolutely.
right?
Yeah, that's right.
Because it's
Research
not
hasn't been done.
tested well, and there's still no, it's not made public, and the cup brings in less oxygen than these super absorbent tampons, but it's still a little bit. And in the conclusion of my book, I'd say we really need to know if you have the TSST1 antibody, then you should know that. Like, have I developed the antibody? If I haven't developed that antibody, then you probably should be counseled to not wear tampons.
So girls could be tested for that?
Yeah, there is a test for it, yes. Yeah.
So that should be a kind of,
We get tested for everything else, I don't know, yeah.
Okay, should we do one more question? I think you have one? Well, that was kind of my question.
So I run an information website about menstrual health, and I have very limited, I say use the least absorbent product for your flow, wash your hands before insertion, all those kinds of things. But then when you mentioned the TSST1 antibody, I've never heard of that, and I've been researching this for 6 years.
I know.
So, and I didn't know there was a test. Where is this locked behind? Where is this research?
And
I mean, I've called the guys who developed the test. That's how I know, which, you know, I guess so I did this research so you don't have to. So it's in the conclusion of my book. Yeah, but yeah, no, why don't we know this? Like, this is not a crazy thing to have, really, we get tested for so many other things. What?
Is it a blood test or is it an easy test?
Yeah.
It's a swab, isn't it?
You know, I'm not even sure, actually. I talked to one of the guys who wanted to sell it over the counter, like HIV tests. He had it that far developed, but there was all this kind of like, we don't know, what if happens if it's strep instead of staph? But so, yeah, so the technology is there. It is there.
Do they still use vaginas?
Yes. Yeah, if you go to YouTube, you can see the one that I was going to show. Put in Syngina YouTube, or YouTube Syngina, and it'll go.
Okay, I'm afraid we have to stop. You can grab Sharra afterwards if
I'll
you're
be
still
here.
awake.
I'll be here. I'm good.
But let's just thank her again for such a fantastic presentation.